Hi, Journeyers. I'm Tony Carnes, your host for A Journey Through NYC Religions Television. Have you noticed how much discussion there is about the state of our country? Are we falling apart? Are we totally divided? Is democracy on the edge of the cliff? And how about our churches? Is faith in God declining in the United States? Are the people leaving the churches never to come back? How about those evangelicals? Are they being hit by all of these clamors? Well, evidently they are. Are they crumbling and retreating? Or maybe they're the cause of our problem because they've been politically active on one side. To sort out some of these questions, and I've asked Collin Hansen to come join us so that we might have sort of an expert eye from within the maelstrom. Collin is the vice president of the Gospel Coalition, which is a key website and event producer for the evangelical Christians. It was co-founded by a pastor here in New York, Reverend Tim Keller, which Collin has a biography out on him, which you can take a look at. And he also does a podcast called Gospel Bound and produces events that brings pastors from and other people from all across the nation and world. They are also in multiple languages. Collin, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks for having me, Tony.
Well, tell me, what is the state of American evangelicalism from your perspective?
I might borrow from a previous work and say embattled and thriving. So thriving in the sense that religion, I should say Christianity in America is Christian affiliation, church membership is in a pretty significant decline in a lot of different ways. In the last 25 years, 40 million Americans have left the church. And certainly many of those have left evangelical churches because there are so many evangelical churches. But it's quite a few fewer people leaving than, say, compared to Roman Catholics or mainline or liberal Protestants. And so in that sense, evangelicals by comparison holding their own in terms of the share of the population, around 25% of our country. They're thriving by comparison. You can look all over the place at book sales and at churches and large churches and small churches and denominational churches and non-denominational churches, and you can still see a very large and prospering evangelical movement. And I think probably, Tony, most viewers are going to know that primarily, especially if they're not evangelicals themselves. They're going to know that through politics. So evangelicals are in many ways the largest homogenous, in terms of voting largely the same way, bloc in the country. There's no comparable group. Roman Catholics are a little bit more split in terms of how they vote. And maybe the closest group would be those who claim no religion, the nuns. And so evangelicals represent that largest voting bloc, as we've seen consistently, that favors the GOP. But that's where a lot of the embattled comes in, because a lot of the motivation behind evangelicals in their work is a sense in which they have lost their place or their voice in the broader culture, especially in academics and in media and things like that. So in a certain sense, they feel embattled, and then within that, they don't agree necessarily with themselves. It may not be clear to somebody who isn't inside. They may look and say, well, I mean, 80% of them voted for President Trump. That seems to be pretty unified to me. But there are very different attitudes about President Trump and about politics in general, ranging from complete enthusiastic, over-the-top support to I'm holding my nose. I just wish we could get anybody different and better, but he's better than the alternative. And so there's a lot of the embattling, both externally and internally, among evangelicals.
Are evangelicals voting is sort of like a embattled ethnic group? As you know, here in New York, we've had in Harlem, for example, we had an Italian congressman in East Harlem who was close to the mafia, but and he was also a communist of all things, a communist mafia member, and he got elected time and time again because at that time, that is in the 30s and the 40s and even 50s, the Italians in the East of Harlem would come out to support him because they say, well, he's a scoundrel, but he's our scoundrel.
Our scoundrel, yeah.
And the same thing would happen in Central Harlem with Reverend Adam Clayton Powell being a notable pastor. His son was a pastor also, but not so notable, and was a little bit of a scoundrel. And yet, even though they threw him out of the House of Representatives at one point, he comes back as being reelected as congressman, so they had to put up with him. And why did they vote for him? Why did the church people vote for him in Harlem? Well, two reasons. One, he's our guy. And two, it makes our opponents, the people that we feel that oppress us, the whites, it sort of upsets them. So we got a 2-for-1 with Reverend Alan Clayton Powell Jr. So is it something like that that's going on with evangelicals, or is it something else?
I think you've got a good theory there, Tony. At some level in our politics now, broadly speaking, it's not so much what you're for, it's who hates you. It's more tribal in a lot of ways, and the divides are geographic through sorting, and especially they're through education. Well, we also know ethnicity, that's a significant divider, but education as well. And so for evangelicals, many of whom do not have college education or graduate education or deep connections there. I mean, just like the rest of the American population, only 40% of our population has college education. But there's a sense in which they are left out of the elite discourses and decision making, and that places like New York City look down on them, that the elites, these so-called elites, look down on them. And so one of the things that President Trump did so effectively from a political perspective is he galvanized and mobilized that scorn to his favor, which is, of course, an ultimate irony considering his background as an elite mainline Protestant, rich businessman from New York. And that was part of his political giftedness, was mobilizing that sense of common grievance about not only what was happening in the country and the world, but especially of how people different from them looked at them. And so I think you've got a good theory there. So it's why, from the outsider perspective, they might look at evangelicals and think, wow, they have a tremendous amount of power, the largest voting bloc in America. And yet at the same time, evangelicals themselves can feel like they're on the outs, that they don't have any influence except at the ballot box, where they look to consistently send a message to the people that they perceive to look down on them.
I have two questions here. One is that sometimes people will say that, well, 80% of white evangelicals
Right.
voted for Donald Trump for president. Now, that was promoted by the Washington Post, for example, in articles, but actually it's not quite right. Did you know that?
Well, considering all the white evangelicals who didn't vote at all, of course.
Well,
so
that word evangelical, if you look at the stats, that includes, people were asked two questions: are you Protestant, Catholic, Jewish,
Right.
other options? And it's another question: are you an evangelical? Well, that means you could be a Buddhist and mark evangelical, and there were some Buddhists that marked evangelical.
Right.
And a pretty large portion of the white evangelical, this is from the exit poll from the election
Right.
that it's taken from, a pretty large percentage were Catholics.
Yeah.
So the white evangelical is really white evangelical Protestants and Catholics.
Yeah.
So I think that what's been happening here is that it pleases some people to focus on the evangelical Protestants because they see them as a tough enemy, and they want to put them on defensive. Am I right about that?
Well, I think it's an excellent point. First, a clarification that it is white evangelicals, but that's a shorthand. That's how sociologists and pollsters have chosen to segment them out, which itself is a little bit confusing and skews the perspective when you consider the very large numbers of African American, Asian American, and Hispanic evangelicals. So that in itself is confusing on the front. And then second, you're exactly right, Tony. It's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. For when I'm doing interviews with ABC or CNN or different places like that, they usually only talk to me about politics. They're really not interested in anything else. So there's a sense in which, this actually happened to me on PBS NewsHour. They said to me, "Why are evangelicals so obsessed with politics?" And I said, "We're not, but you don't ever ask me to talk about anything else. You're obsessed with evangelical views of politics because that's what you cover." And so there's a sense in which it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that evangelical is reduced to being a political descriptor. But then as it's reduced to being a political descriptor, that political descriptor becomes shorthand for a person who is white, who votes Republican and claims some religious background.
Well, let me dig into that.
Doesn't tell you anything.
Well, let me dig into that. They try to put in more content than that. They would call you, maybe not to your face, but behind your back, a white Christian nationalist.
Yeah, right.
Are you a white Christian nationalist?
I don't believe so, but it depends on your definition. That can range all the way. The way I typically define Christian nationalist is somebody who conflates the promises of the Old Testament church with the United States of America, or the Old Testament, God's people in the Old Testament, Israel, with the United States today. And there is a long history of this. In some ways, you could see the Puritans this way. You could see some of the founders being this way. So at some level, there's been a lot of that, even going back to, in some ways, some of the language that President Reagan used evoked some of those older notions of the city on a hill, which, of course, is language from Jesus himself. And so there's that sense in which some people have talked about that in explicit ways. But then there's also a group of people where if you say more Christian influence on the United States would be a positive thing, or that the United States was founded on Christian principles. Well, depending on what you intended with that, I would definitely say yes, there would be no United States of America without Christian principles. That's not even arguable from a historical perspective. And as a Christian, I naturally would hope for more Christian influence on my homeland. So if that makes me a Christian nationalist, then yes, I guess I am. But that would also be really not illustrative of anything, because that's how the vast majority of Christians have always seen things in the United States.
It's interesting. Most of the people that have come out with this model of white Christian nationalism are pretty much against the evangelicals and see it as a good club to beat the head on. And in fact, the surveys they do are somewhat questionable. Yeah. But I'd like to also their definition and what it means and how it operates in people's lives is left very vague, so they can fill in anything they want. They can imagine the worst possible scenario, that there is a small group of 10 people going to take over the United States government and act as an Oliver Cromwell protectorate. But in fact, Pew did a survey, it just came out, by the way, that says, what do you mean by white Christian nationalists? They asked this question, which should have been asked all along. Yeah. It wasn't, because that wouldn't give them what they wanted. And finally, they asked people, were they white? Were they Christian nationalists? They didn't say white Christian, Christian nationalists.
No.
Well, what they found out is, yes, about half of the country would say we're Christian nationalists, 44%. Well,
Yeah.
that's a pretty big, and so then what do you mean? You mean they're going to impose Christianity? In fact, most of the people use it this way. We believe that just like you used it, the morals and values of this country reflect a Christian history,
Right.
and is something we would like to sustain itself.
Right.
Almost all of these people were against creating a state religion.
Right.
A small portion said, I want to make Christianity the state religion. That was the smallest portion. Most, though, the center in various ways would say, well, I want to bring Christian values. It's a practice in our life and society, but I don't want to make, Christianity our state religion. In fact, there was very strong feelings among the so-called Christian nationalists against that, which, by the way, it means blows up the whole model.
Well, I'm
Except for
grateful.
maybe that small group that really do want to take over the government. There are some, or at
Yeah.
least they say they are. If you asked them, they didn't ask this question, but it would have been, says, are you willing to, for that small, very small percent to say, yeah, we want Christianity as the state religion, 24% of the, 1/4 or less, depending how you ask the question, would like to do that, of the so-called Christian nationalists. In other words, most do not. You might ask them, says, well, what would you do to do that? Would you do anything about that? Is that a high priority for you? And in fact, I suspect that you'll find that thing cuts down the number even smaller. And we're left with a model that's in tatters.
Yeah.
That really maybe is no longer any use, because it's so poorly predictive of what people really believe. I mean, do you find, and maybe I should ask you, you run across a lot of people in your network of churches, how many would be the really hardline Christian nationalists that want to impose Christianity on the United States?
Not many, Tony. But what's
A few.
interesting is that there is an attitude that relates to what I had said earlier about the kind of sneering or some of the conflating that you're describing right there. You do have some politically attuned Christian leaders who recognize that the kind of mistakes that you describe are advantageous to weaponize against the quote unquote elites who are out to get us. And so what they'll do is they'll say, okay, so you want to say that I'm a Christian nationalist? Fine. I'll be a Christian nationalist. I'll write the case for Christian nationalism, and I'll go even farther, in some sense, just to make you angry, just because I know it's going to scare you.
How many of those people are there?
Not many, but again, part of it's just play acting, because the thing is, Tony, we are so far away from anything like that actually happening in this unwieldy democracy, this unwieldy republic, that in some ways it's like a child who threatens all kinds of things to his or her parents because they just know it'll scare them, but they'll never act.
Well, what happened in January 6th?
Well, it wasn't Christian nationalism. I mean, that's simply I think we know what happened in January 6th. You had a president who knew he was going to lose the election, but had no intention of being able to accept it. And so rallied a massively large number of people who voted for him, many of whom fervently, and was able to mobilize a small subset of them through inflammatory rhetoric and through the absolutely irresponsible and horrible assistance of some bad actors in Congress and elsewhere.
Now, as I understand so far, there's been only one pastor that was part of the group that entered the Capitol. Is that right? Have you
I'm
heard?
not sure about that. And I've written about this, Tony. I think what was so confusing to so many of us watching this, and remains confusing now, is that on certain elements of the right, patriotic and Christian symbols are easily transposed. But that's not a new thing. That it's a common thing going way back. We've seen that consistently. So it's admittedly quite confusing for me and anybody else watching January 6th and seeing a cross or seeing evangelists. But then somebody says, well, no, they weren't part of the attacks. They were there to actually evangelize the groups that were there. So again, just the whole thing becomes quite confusing. But just admittedly, there's all sorts of symbolism that is all mixed up. And I remember early on, there was a rally here in Mobile, Alabama for President Trump when he was a candidate. And there's just this conflating on the right with kind of hope, almost like the messianic hopes for deliverance that are easily transposed from a political figure to their Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. So, yeah, I mean, there's something to this that we don't want to dismiss. At the same time, it's, I think, less dangerous than perhaps it's pointed out to be. It's more of a fringe attitude, I think.
Now, is all of this, even if it's minor in the total picture, is this dividing? You hear a lot about evangelicals being divided and leaving the church, and there is the Kristen Dumas who says,
Right.
I don't want to be called an evangelical,
Right.
and I'm against conflating Jesus and John Wayne.
Right.
Um, is this dividing the church? Is this creating a? Some people say the evangelical church is over
Yeah.
because it's going to be split apart. Is it going to be split apart? What's going on?
Well, I think, Tony, the most helpful things I've seen are the people. George Packer would be an example of this in the Atlantic, his Four Americas. In fact, as the whole country is dividing into four different categories. There's an illiberal right, there's an illiberal left, and then there are procedural liberal, by which I mean the old American standards of fairness and openness and, investing in institutions, kind of left and right in there. And the evangelicals map onto the same category. You have some on the left, not many, but some on the illiberal, anti-institutional left that just believe, no, we need to impose everything by power. You have a good number of them on the right, same thing. Forget the norms of democracy. We just need to impose power. We need to punish our enemies. We need to gain power so we can punish our enemies. And then you have two groups in the middle that I think are in many ways larger, but in a polarized environment don't get as much attention, where they still want to kind of play fair by the old American standards of democracy and republicanism.
So
Um,
what is
good.
the future of the evangelicals movement? Are they going to continue to support pro-life positions? Or are they going to say, oh, we got too much backfire on that, let's give up that idea? Are they going to still majority support Republican or Trump candidates? Or are we going to
Yeah.
find that the whole operation is just going to grind to a halt?
I think you're going to see more of the same. I think, Tony, I have made mistakes in the past as a pundit and as a writer, assuming sharp disjunctions. But really, when you go back and back and back and back in American political and evangelical history, you see a lot of continuities and a lot of consistencies. And I don't see them going anywhere. I don't see the backlash to Dobbs was anticipated. But the fact that Dobbs happened at all was, if anything, a ratification for evangelicals' political activity over the last period of time. And I think even as we're talking, some of the salience of the pushback has been lost on that issue as well. But largely, we're just seeing the same thing everywhere, Tony, is that in many ways, state governments, local governments are fracturing and they're pushing to the edges. And so if you're looking at, say, California, you're not going to see a lot of political strength. You're still going to see a lot of big, huge evangelical churches. And then in the South, you're going to see both. A lot of political strength as well as a lot of those large
Well,
churches.
well,
So more the same, I anticipate.
let me ask in this regard. Some people try to make sense of this, and you sort of hinted at this, that that there are other periods of American history that were similar to today. Do you think that we are closer to the World War One period, where we had the Roaring Twenties and an epidemic, and then a disaster,
Yeah.
or are we the 1960s revisited, and then the 60s and 70s with the age of Aquarius going along with some toward the end, a Jesus movement? Which one
Yeah.
are we? Are we sort of both?
Oh, I love talking about this with you, Tony, because I can tell how much insight you bring to this question. Remember, of course, 1960s and 1970s. What did they also give way to? A political crisis in Iran, an energy crisis, inflation, and high interest rates.
Yeah.
So we've got some commonalities there. Again, what I think see with both of these is that there's always been, whenever you think religion is going to disappear or get stamped out in American history, Christianity tends to surprise you by roaring back. And in my work on Tim Keller, one of the things that stood out to me was just how scary his college years were in so many different ways. He had a conversion experience right before the Kent State shootings, 1970. And so anyway, you just see, but then in the middle of that, you mentioned it, the Jesus movement came out of that. So we're never far away, no matter how much chaos there is, we're never far away from, at least in American history, often a spiritual revival. You mentioned the 20s and 30s. Of course, they lead to the horrible World War II. What follows World War II and the rise of communism, a huge religious awakening as well, Protestant, Catholic, and Jew.
You
Uh,
know, I'd like to talk about this more, but we're running out of time. But I think it would be instructive and helpful. Are we post World War One with Billy Sunday as one of the leading
yeah,
pastors,
yeah.
or post World War II with Billy Graham going into the 60s and 70s, or a new age with Tim Keller being the symbolic pastor leading into it? I don't know, but read Collin Hansen's book on Timothy Keller and other books that he has in print. Collin, thank you for being here, and best to you.
Thank you, Tony.
Journeyers, thank you. Bye-bye.